The Korean Peninsula, 1951. A frozen frontier where two superpowers clashed in everything but name. Above the Yalu River, in a narrow corridor the Americans called MiG Alley, the jet age entered a violent adolescence. Here, the Soviet Union fielded its prized creation, the MiG-15, a machine born from German swept-wing research and Soviet industrial urgency. On paper, it was superior. It could climb faster, reach higher altitudes, and unleash heavy cannon fire capable of shredding a bomber in a single burst. For the Soviet pilots secretly serving under Chinese markings, the expectation was simple. They should dominate the sky. Yet, from the first major engagements, something didn't add up. Reports trickled in from frontline detachments. Accounts filled not with triumph but with confusion. Pilots described American F-86 Sabres performing beyond the limits written in any Western technical manual. They spoke of engagements where the Sabre hung impossibly on their tail in steep climbs, where American fire, lighter, smaller caliber, seemingly inferior, found its mark at distances that defied common sense. And these weren't inexperienced recruits panicking under pressure. Many Soviet aviators in Korea were decorated veterans of the Great Patriotic War, men who had fought the Luftwaffe over Kursk, Leningrad, and Berlin. They knew how aircraft should behave. They knew what was possible and what wasn't. Yet they were being outshot. These encounters forced a disturbing set of questions into the Soviet command structure. The MiG-15 possessed raw performance advantages that should have made the F-86 fight defensively, relying on speed dives and luck rather than marksmanship. Instead, Soviet squadron leaders reported engagements where Sabre pilots fired short, controlled bursts that struck with uncanny precision, often from deflection angles and ranges where success should have been nearly impossible. The bullet groupings on damaged MiGs were tight, consistent, almost mathematical. Something was wrong, badly wrong. When the debriefings began, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Pilots swore they had maneuvered aggressively, exploiting the MiG's superior climb rate, only to watch the American aircraft maintain firing solutions that should have been unattainable. Ground crews studied the damage. Analysts reviewed the combat data. And the conclusion shocked everyone involved. The Americans weren't winning because of pilot bravado or superior airframes. They were winning because the F-86 was behaving as if it possessed information the MiG-15 did not. The Soviet Air Force knew it had entered a new era, one where speed alone was no longer enough. And as these early encounters accumulated, the question that haunted every pilot preparing to take off from Antung was no longer, can I outfly them? But rather, what are they using that we cannot see? The search for that answer would uncover a technological gap far more consequential than anyone in 1951 could have predicted. The earliest Soviet attempts to explain the Sabre's behavior leaned on familiar assumptions. Perhaps the Americans were simply flying recklessly, pushing their airframes past safe tolerances, or relying on unusually high levels of pilot training. But those theories didn't survive long. Many Soviet instructors had studied NATO tactics extensively. They knew that American doctrine emphasized discipline, not improvisation. And the gun camera footage that returned from surviving MiG engagements showed something even more troubling. The F-86 pilots were not guessing. Their firing passes were deliberate, timed, and suspiciously consistent across multiple squadrons. That consistency suggested a system, not instinct. By late 1951, the puzzle had grown so large that the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps launched its own informal investigation. Debriefings took on a new urgency. Pilots were asked to map their maneuvers, list engine settings, describe enemy angles, and even record how long American tracers remained visible during evasion. The questions were clinical, almost forensic, and they all pointed toward the same anomaly. The Sabres achieved firing solutions too quickly and too accurately for the speeds involved. Veterans of the Great Patriotic War, men who had dueled Bf-109s and FW-190s, were blunt in their assessments. A deflection shot at jet speeds required a perfect prediction of where the enemy would be in the next second or two. At 900 kilometers per hour closure, that prediction had to be instantaneous. No sight used in World War II, Soviet or Western, could manage that reliably. Yet the F-86 pilots were executing such shots repeatedly. Something was feeding them calculations faster than human perception could keep up with. Soon, Rumors spread among Soviet airmen stationed at Antung and Mukden. Some believed the Sabres' radar, already known to be mounted in the nose intake, was more advanced than expected, possibly guiding the aircraft automatically. Others speculated that the Americans had developed a new gunsight that adjusted in real time, compensating for angle, g-forces, and target motion. These theories had no official confirmation, but they explained the uncanny accuracy that pilots witnessed in the sky. Behind the scenes, Soviet intelligence officers were growing increasingly alarmed. If the Americans possessed an advanced computational gunsight, it meant MiG Alley was not just a battlefield, it was a test range. A proving ground where the U.S. was refining technology that could eventually be fitted to interceptors guarding the continental United States. If such technology allowed American jets to consistently kill MiGs, what would it do against future Soviet bombers intended to reach the Pacific? The implications reached far beyond Korea. By the winter of 1951, the 64th Corps realized it could not continue fighting blind. The mystery of the Sabres' accuracy was now a matter of strategic survival. And so, a new objective emerged, one more urgent than any patrol over the Yalu River. They had to uncover what was inside the F-86 nose. To solve the puzzle, the Soviets needed something they had never secured intact. A downed F-86 Sabre that hadn't been obliterated by American self-destruction protocols. The U.S. Air Force was painfully aware that whatever gave their pilots the edge in MiG Alley could not fall into enemy hands. Whenever a Sabre crashed behind opposing lines, American aircraft were dispatched to bomb the wreckage, napalm the remains, or strafe the debris until no usable component survived. Even pilots were briefed that if they had to abandon their aircraft, they should disable specific panels before ejecting. This American obsession with destroying wreckage only intensified Soviet suspicions. The 64th Corps began tracking F-86 losses obsessively. Ground spotters along the Yalu recorded every plume of smoke, every emergency bailout, every crash site visible from Chinese territory. When word came that a Sabre had gone down closer to friendly forces, recovery teams mobilized instantly. These weren't standard infantrymen. They were mixed units of engineers, mechanics, and intelligence officers tasked specifically with the retrieval of aircraft components. Their orders were simple: extract anything that revealed what the Americans were hiding. Most attempts ended in disappointment. Either the crash had been too violent, or American aircraft had already incinerated the remains. But early in 1952, a rare opportunity emerged. During a high-speed pursuit near the frozen marshlands west of Sinuiju, an F-86 suffered catastrophic engine failure. The pilot ejected, and the jet impacted the soft mud of the riverbank rather than rock or ice. The mud smothered the fire, extinguishing it before it could spread through the fuselage. For the first time, an American Sabre lay intact enough to study. The recovery team worked through the night, hauling the battered airframe out of the marsh and placing it on a convoy bound for an airfield deeper inside Chinese territory. A tarp covered the wreckage, but even through the folds of fabric the engineers could see what mattered most. The nose section was largely preserved. The intake lip, radar cavity, and gunsight housing were recognizable. The cockpit canopy was shattered, but many of the sight components remained accessible. When Soviet analysts inspected the recovered machine, the reaction was immediate. The gunsight was unlike anything they had encountered. It was not a simple optical reflector or a manual Euro-stabilized reticle like those used in World War II. The casing was dense, layered with unfamiliar wiring, miniature vacuum tubes, and gyroscopic assemblies of remarkable precision. Even damaged, it was clear the device acted as a kind of analog computer, one designed to solve ballistic equations faster than any pilot could. The discovery confirmed their fears. The Americans had introduced computation into air combat. That realization sent shockwaves back to Moscow. Because if the Sabre's advantage wasn't aerodynamic but informational, then the very foundation of Soviet air doctrine was in jeopardy. The recovered gunsight was transported with extreme caution to a secure Soviet facility in northeastern China, where engineers from multiple design bureaus were granted limited access. These were specialists accustomed to reverse engineering Western technology, but even they were stunned by what they saw when the sight's outer casing was removed. Inside, instead of the simple pendulum-based stabilizers common in Soviet designs, They found a compact network of gyroscopes, magnetic amplifiers, and fluid-damped components arranged with surgical precision. Every solder joint, every wire angle, every bearing seemed manufactured to tolerances far beyond anything achievable in typical Soviet workshops of the early 1950s. But technology alone wasn't the revelation. It was the sight's purpose. As the engineers traced the internal connections, they realized the gunsight received data from a small radar unit embedded in the Sabre's air intake. At first glance, the radar seemed too small to offer any meaningful advantage. But further examination revealed its true role. It fed continuous distance measurements directly into the gunsight computer. With range data, turn rate, aircraft orientation, and target motion all being accounted for simultaneously, the sight could calculate the exact point in space where a burst of .50 caliber fire needed to converge. This meant the American pilot didn't calculate deflection manually. He simply kept the illuminated reticle on the enemy aircraft and fired. In the context of jet-age speeds, where closure rates often exceeded 1,000 kilometers per hour, this was a decisive leap forward. Such a system removed human estimation from the equation, converting air combat from an art into a form of assisted precision. The F-86 wasn't outmaneuvering the MiG-15, it was outprocessing it. When these findings were relayed to Soviet leadership, the debate shifted from pilot performance to industrial capability. The MiG-15's optical sight, relied upon since the late stages of World War II, simply could not keep pace with the rapid angular changes of jet combat. Soviet pilots were required to pull estimates from experience and instinct, while their American counterparts followed a guided solution. And in a dogfight lasting seconds, that difference proved fatal. Soviet commanders began to understand why their pilots described the Sabres firing as mathematically perfect. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was computation. Yet even as these insights formed, a quieter, more troubling conclusion emerged within the engineering teams. Replicating the American sight wasn't just a matter of copying schematics. It required manufacturing capabilities that the Soviet Union did not yet possess. The precision machining, vacuum tube miniaturization, and Euro fabrication standards were on a level far removed from the heavy industry environment typical of Soviet factories. In other words, the Soviet Air Force had uncovered the secret, but knowing it was not the same as matching it. And as the engineers debated feasibility, the pilots in MiG Alley continued to face the harsh reality of that technological imbalance every time they took to the sky. By mid-1952, the Soviet Air Force attempted to integrate the findings from the recovered Sabre into its tactical doctrine. But there was an unavoidable gap between understanding a technology and fielding a counter to it. The MiG-15 had been designed as a blunt instrument, fast, aggressive, and heavily armed. Its designers focused on raw performance, altitude, thrust, and cannon firepower. In contrast, the F-86 represented a different philosophy. An aircraft built around an integrated system where pilot, radar, and gunsight worked as a single mechanism. This philosophical divide became painfully evident in combat. Soviet pilots were instructed to fly erratically, trying to deny the Sabre pilot a stable tracking opportunity. On paper, this seemed logical. If the American gunsight relied on range and angular prediction, unpredictable maneuvering might break its calculations. But in practice, the tactic backfired. Hard turns bled energy, robbing the MiG-15 of its one true advantage, vertical performance. Once the MiG lost speed, the Sabre could close the gap, settle behind it, and allow the gunsight to compute the firing solution. The Soviet assumption that unpredictability created safety had, counterintuitively, made their aircraft easier targets. Combat data reinforced the trend. At distances where optical sights became unreliable, typically beyond 600 meters, the Sabre's radar-assisted system remained effective. Pilots flying with the A-series gunsight often reported kills achieved with short bursts, the kind that reflected confidence in both their weapon and the computation guiding it. Meanwhile, Soviet after-action reports increasingly described hits arriving from ranges they considered beyond practical firing envelopes. The technology gap had become a tactical one. Soviet command, now facing mounting losses, shifted its priorities. Instead of seeking dominance, the new directive emphasized survival. Pilots were told to avoid prolonged engagements, strike only when holding clear positional advantage, and disengaged the moment an F-86 appeared behind them. The MiG Alley Air War, once expected to showcase the superiority of the MiG-15, morphed into a cautionary theater where pilots learned to respect a weapon they couldn't yet understand. Behind the front lines, design bureaus were ordered to begin developing a Soviet equivalent to the American system. The concept was straightforward: replicate the gunsight, integrate a small radar, and restore parity. But as engineers compared the internal components of the captured site to available Soviet manufacturing tools, the scale of the challenge became clear. Producing such a system required precision machining, stable gyros, consistent vacuum tube fabrication, and access to cleanroom environments. These were not areas in which Soviet industry excelled in the early 1950s. For the pilots flying daily sorties, however, industrial limitations were abstract concerns. Their reality was simpler. In the skies over Korea, technology, not bravery, not skill, was increasingly dictating survival. And each encounter deepened a growing realization within the Soviet command structure. The Americans had introduced computation into air combat, and the Soviet Union would either adapt or continue to pay the cost in aircraft and airmen. In the end, MiG Alley was more than an air battlefield. It was the moment the jet age revealed its true direction. It showed that the future of air combat would no longer be decided by raw speed or cannon size, but by the invisible mathematics guiding the guns. And for the first time, the Soviet Union understood that the next great struggle would be fought not only in the skies, but in the laboratories that shaped them. If you found this story insightful, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more Cold War history, untold aviation episodes, and deep dives into the technology that reshaped global power. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these forgotten chapters alive.